Romans chapter 5. Romans chapter 5. We're going to be looking at, well, we'll start about verse 12 here in just a moment. Sometimes we discuss these, by one man sin entered the world, and by one man sin found an answer, and we kind of look at that segment of Scripture sometimes isolated from where it was actually written. And that may be a mistake. You might be able to get a better understanding of what Paul's trying to convey if we make sure we remember the theme and topic that he's been under discussion prior to this. If you recall, basically he's trying to emphasize the point that you're not going to get salvation or you're not going to be deemed righteous by perfect obedience to what? To law. And in particular to the Jews, that meant the Old Testament law, the law of Moses. And so he's been trying to illustrate that in various ways. And what he did just prior to this is he pointed to what individual? Abraham, right? He points to Abraham, and in chronology, Abraham comes before Moses, right? Okay, so Abraham is before Moses, so he's before the Mosaic law ever came to be, and Abraham was imputed righteousness because of what? Because of his faith, okay? Because Abraham was a believer. Because of his faith, God deemed him righteous. Not that Abraham earned it, not that he merited it, but God deemed him righteous because of his faith in the Creator. And he did all that prior to the Mosaic law. In fact, Paul even illustrates that Abraham did that and was found righteous in the eyes of God before what particular instruction came? Before circumcision. Okay? One of the key issues that the Jews had in relationship to trying to maintain the Old Testament law, even while trying to honor Jesus at the same time, was they still were convicted in their minds that circumcision was a necessary aspect. If you're going to be saved, it's got to be practiced. And so Paul simply points them to Abraham and says, notice that Abraham had righteousness imputed to him prior to the time that circumcision became in force. So now, in chapter 5 and verse 12, as Paul just continues this argument, now where does he back up to? Okay, so we've been making this argument, right? Paul's been trying to illustrate this point, that there's an answer, and the answer is Jesus, and faith in Him. And every illustration that you point to ultimately becomes connected to Jesus. Abraham's had a promise, a seed promise. All nations of the world will be blessed through that promise. That promise was culminated in Jesus. The Jews needed to point and recognize the center thought of Jesus and the implication that He needs to be believed in and honored in order for them to find salvation, not some kind of perfect law keeping. So, he goes back to Adam, verse 12. Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. By the way, who sinned first? Eve did, right? So this lesson, here's the reason I bring that up. This lesson isn't about who did what first, or it's about what happened because of the scene in the garden. It's about what occurred there, what got pushed forward in terms of men's actions that ultimately necessitated the need for Jesus to come into the picture. By one man, sin entered into the world, and death by sin. What kind of death, by the way? Spiritual. That's the context here, right? Literally both. Okay, literally both. If you wanted to go back and look at it historically, both physical death and spiritual death are ushered in at that moment that sin enters the picture. But the context of thought here is righteousness, unrighteousness, salvation, not saved. That's the conversation. And so here the implication is spiritual death comes into play because of sin. So death passed upon all men. For what reason, by the way? At the end of that verse. For that all have sinned. Not inherit because they inherited Adam's sin, right? Not because Adam's sin was passed along from generation after generation after generation after generation. He said that this death, this spiritual condemnation that comes because of sin, was passed along not because Adam kept perpetuating it through birth to every person who was ever born, but it's passed along because everybody after him did what? Sinned. And that's exactly what Paul says at the end of verse 12. Go ahead, Bob. Yeah, and we'll get there. I think Paul addresses it. I think he does before this context is over. And I just don't want to jump ahead to get there. But I will address it though before we leave the context, because he makes a point. Look at verse 13, because it actually ushers in your question. For until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed where there is no law. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over them that had not sinned, after the similitude of Adam's transgression, who is the figure of him that was to come. And so what I want you to notice, by the way, is once in a while you maybe, if you write or you might be sending a note and you say something and you feel like it needs a little extra explanation. And what do you do with it? You put it in parentheses. Did you notice, particularly in the King James Version, what happens from verse 13 through verse 17? It's all in parentheses. This is all a greater explanation that Paul is offering to the point that he just made. So whatever Paul says from verses 13 through verse 17 needs to be understood as an explanation of this point that he just made. That by one man's sin entered, and that because all men after him have sinned, they are all in need of Christ. And here is the greater explanation of why that is true. That Paul isn't necessarily trying to make a new point in verses 13 through 17. He's trying, in my estimation, he's trying to explain the point that he already made. Yeah, that's right. And so you'll have a new thought that comes after his greater explanation. So, and I just simply illustrate that to you so that you'll think about that before we start ascribing, defining thoughts to verses 13 to 17. Make sure you connect it to verse 12, because it has to point to verse 12 in order to work in the manner in which he writes this section. So he says, for until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed when there is no law. In other words, he tells a Jewish audience, Sin didn't just happen when the Old Testament law, sure, because you had a law and you knew exactly what you were supposed to do and what you weren't supposed to do. Sin could be imputed through that law. But sin's been around since Adam. Sin's been around long before the law was around. The problem that Jesus is trying to answer is not a Rome problem. It's not an Old Testament law problem. It is not an Adam problem. It's an all of the above problem. The answer that Jesus brings forth resolves the problem of sin for everybody. Those whose sins were imputed through law, those whose sins occurred without some specific construct of written law, but they gained their knowledge by, how do they learn what was right and wrong in those days? Right. So instructions came and they did what with it? They passed it on. We call that the age of the patriarchs, right? Why do we define it as the age of the patriarchs? Right? So we call the age of the patriarchs, we call the time of Moses' law that, because the law that was passed down through Moses, and then we talk about the age of Christianity, where the new covenant in Jesus Christ. But why do we call it the days of the patriarchs?
Because the fathers were the ones that were given.
Right. So God's speaking very directly, and that information is passed generation after generation through the family ties. And so before the Old Testament law, there was sin. During the Old Testament law, there was sin. Before Jesus enters the picture in Rome, or before the days that Paul's writing here, there was sin. Nevertheless, that's the point he's making, verse 14. Nevertheless, death reigned simply because there was no Mosaic law around to impute some sin to somebody didn't mean there wasn't sin. The Old Testament law isn't the only way to understand what right and wrong is in the eyes of God. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over them that had not sinned after the similitude of Adam's transgression, who is the figure of him that was to come. Now here's what's interesting. Let's think of for a moment, what was the sin that Adam committed? Okay, and how did he know he shouldn't have done that? God told him not to, right? Adam had a specific command. Don't eat that fruit from that tree. And he did anyway. But other sins come along after Adam that aren't attributed necessarily to some specific direction, but sins that can occur because we break the very moral standard of God, or we breach what God had been educating them through the fathers over time that He desired from them as people. In other words, sin is varied. Sin comes because of all kinds of reasons. Not just because God said it and I did it anyway. But sin can come because God established certain principles and I just ignored them. Sin can come because I refused to pattern my life after the goodness that God created me in. There's all kinds of reasons that sin. And so Paul's basically saying that not just one kind of sin entered the picture, because you don't have to sin exactly like Adam did to still be a what? Still be a sinner. And if a sinner, then in need of Jesus, right? That's, to me, all that Paul's trying to instill in our minds here. Sin was around from Adam to Moses. Sin didn't just come about when the Old Testament law got started. Sin's been a problem forever. So, almost forever. It's at least until the time after Adam and Eve chose to make their decision. He's a figure, he says, verse 14. He's the figure of what is to come. Not the spitting image of, not in the similitude of. Not everybody's sins are going to fit the exact description of what Adam did. But all men have sinned and made choices contrary to the will of God from that point forward. And that's the reason why grace is needed and mercy is needed and Jesus is needed. But not as the offense. Verse 15. So also is the free gift. For if through the offense of one many be dead, much more the grace of God and the gift by grace, which is by one man, Jesus Christ, hath abounded unto many. Various sins, various people, various circumstances, some under a law of patriarchs, some like Adam, some because they were under an Old Testament law that they ignored and violated, some because they ignored the moral standard of God. There might be any number of reasons that you could illustrate how sin came to be in the lives of individuals. And it all can be summed up in the same answer, though. Regardless of how they got there. They need the grace of God. The gift that comes by grace, that came through one man, Jesus Christ. We don't inherit Adam's sin, but because he began a process whereby all men have chosen to sin, it established the need for Jesus to come and for His grace to be extended, that unmerited favor to be extended and abound to many. Everybody needs it, and His response, His sacrifice, allows for that to happen. Thoughts or comments up to that point? Cloudy or clear? Where are we? Hopefully we're okay. Verse 16. And not as it was by one that sinned, so is the gift. For the judgment was by one to condemnation, but the free gift is of many offenses unto justification. There may have been a specific kind of sin that Adam engaged in, but justification can come to any type of sin, irregardless of what it may be. Though one initiated, various sins came to be, and the gift came in Jesus to cover as many offenses as necessary, to allow for forgiveness, to whatever it is that man's needs create in relationship to sin. That justification can come. And again, that's been the whole discussion, right? We don't lose sight of that. In this letter up to this point, the whole conversation is about justification by faith and justification in Jesus Christ and how it is that we can be justified in the eyes of God despite our sins and behaviors. And he's kind of culminating it. Paul's finally kind of wrapping up the argument. He's done several illustrations to point it out, and he's finally starting to come to the conclusion. For if, verse 17, by one man's offense death reigned by one, much more they which receive abundance of grace and of the gift of righteousness shall reign in life by one, Jesus Christ. Adam's choice ushered in an age of death because of sin. Spiritual alienation from God. Jesus reconciles that relationship. Jesus allows us to receive a gift of righteousness. Righteousness offered or righteousness defined by my goodness and right behavior is earned and merited. He wants us to emphasize one more time that righteousness has never been something earned or merited. You don't earn it. You don't receive it because you've worked diligently enough to receive that. It's offered as a gift. Righteousness comes as the gift through the grace and mercy of Jesus, and everybody is subject to it. From the time of Adam brought in sin to begin with, through that time period, through the Mosaic Law, into the time of Jesus, all points afterwards, righteousness needs to come through faith in Jesus and justification. Go ahead.
A little late on this question, but I was still thinking about how verse 14. Am I to assume from this verse that the sin that other men had was not the same as what Adam's sin was, which was a violation of God's command? So the sins from men after that until the Mosaic Law was not a sin of breaking God's commandments.
Sort of. That's a horrible answer to your question. And here's why. I want to be careful. Because that depends on how we define the commands of God. If we're defining the commands of God as some explicit written law, then yes. That's really what he is talking about. Yeah. Well, and those are things, Bob, the truth be known, we don't know. Right? Ultimately, at the end of that answer is we don't know. It's not recorded for us. There's no point recorded for us how it is. There seems to be plenty of circumstantial evidence, if you want to speak of it in that sense, that illustrates that he should have known. Right? The language, when you read that history of Cain's behavior, there seems to be a clear indication that in some form or fashion he should have known what God desired from him. But how that information was conveyed is not explicitly stated. And what I believe Paul was trying to illustrate here, again, has to be understood in light of his audience. His audience is a Jewish, at this moment in the letter, is a Jewish audience who keeps trusting in the Old Testament law. The idea that sin comes when you breach the Old Testament law. And Paul's answer to that is no, sin can come in all kinds of ways. Adam, yes, he breached a very specific law. But all men have sinned after Adam, not just in the similitude of Adam, not just like Adam did, but for all types of kinds of reasons. I think Paul's earlier argument in the letter about certain things that should be understood by the very nature of man. Man ought to understand he shouldn't kill somebody, right? And he shouldn't need a law on the books in some constitution somewhere for him to understand that. There's a moral fiber that God has instilled in us that we should just understand that that's not right for us to behave in that fashion. And I think that's kind of the thought that he's saying when he's saying that every specific law. But men have sinned from that point forward, not just because they did something specifically stated, don't do it, but because they've made moral choices and decisions that the very nature of man should have told them not to do. Cain's a perfect example, right? He should have understood, without ever having a written law, that to kill his brother wasn't right. And I think in some ways the narrative of that kind of illustrates that to us. So that's what I think Paul's driving at, if that answers your question. That he's driving at sins that are committed, not because there was some specific direct statement made that they violate, but whether it be the very natural moral law that should just be ingrained in because we're made in the likeness of God, whether it be just something that we should have been able to understand and conclude from other specific laws that are given. I think that's what he's driving at in that text.
He mentioned earlier about the Gentiles did by nature without the law.
Yeah. And so it's kind of hard because we kind of bounce back and forth sometimes what Paul's trying to illustrate. But I think he's got the Jewish audience in mind here. And lots of things are done that are sinful, that don't necessarily have anything. And let me take you a step away from that for just one more thought. So then the next natural question for me as a Bible student would be, why would that impact, or how would that impact a Jewish audience? How would that argument? And I think what Paul's trying to illustrate to them is simply, listen, you keep trying to force people to adhere to an Old Testament law that was never their law in order to find salvation, as if somehow they needed that connection. And Paul says, listen, they've got their own host of problems that came to despite the fact that they were never under that law. God isn't giving them a pass. He hasn't given them a permission slip. Oh, you're okay because you never had that law. There are all kinds of sins they committed, but even though they were never under that Mosaic system. That seems to be why Paul's, to me, is trying to convince this Jewish audience, leave them alone. They don't need the Old Testament law. They've got enough problems with the sins they've already committed. They need to be justified in Christ, and so do you. And that maybe seems to be at the heart of what he's driving at.
We sometimes forget in that patriarchal law, Brian, that we need to remember and realize that we have the Creator conversing with the created.
Yeah.
And we have no idea what this conversation is.
Yeah. What all of them would have been like. Yeah. So death reigned. So long as sin had no answer, spiritual death reigned. But much more they which have received abundance of grace and the gift of righteousness shall reign in life by one, Jesus Christ. Sin brought death. Jesus brings life, as he kind of summarizes his explanation of his earlier statement. And then maybe a slight change. So therefore, as by the offense of one judgment came upon all men to condemnation, even so by the righteousness of one the free gift came upon all men unto justification of life. So, sin out of its very nature will require justice from a Creator who cannot accept and or tolerate sinful behaviors. So judgment comes. Judgment's coming upon everybody. Condemnation is coming. It's what's warranted. It's what's just because of sin. And that's everybody included. But just as the age of judgment and condemnation because of sin was ushered in the days of Adam, through Jesus, even so by the righteousness of one, by the sinful behaviors of one, judgment and condemnation was ushered in. By the righteous act, in what condition was Jesus in when He died upon the cross as it relates to sin? Sinless. The only perfect law keeper, the only one who merited righteousness, goes to a cross to bring salvation and forgiveness and justification and life to the condemned and guilty who've been breaching God's will and who have been sinning since the days of Adam. The one who was righteous is the one who ended up paying the price. The one that merited, the only one who ever merited being labeled as righteous, dies upon a cross so that we can find justification and life through Him, because we weren't going to get it on our own. We're not going to merit it or earn it. We talked Wednesday night about the importance of remembering that sometimes we've got to get the order right. And we've got to remember that the primary in our focus should be to live faithful. That our lives should be dedicated to faith in Jesus. More time striving to be faithful to Him, less time trying to figure out whether I'm right all the time. So that we can stay dedicated to the right things in the right order. And he just reemphasizes that here. The one that was righteous was the only one who could bring justification to everybody else. And His death upon the cross does and accomplishes that. For as by one man's, verse 19, for as by one man's disobedience many were made sinners, so by the obedience of one shall many be made righteous. Now, don't forget that Paul has already made the statement, right? Verse at the end of verse 12, that the reason all of this is happening is because everybody else after Adam decided to do what? Sin. That hasn't changed, right? Paul isn't arguing with himself here. He's not saying in one moment that all this happens because everybody sins themselves, and then in the next breath says, no, it's because Adam sinned and everybody gets it because of him. That's not the point. The point is, for as by one man's disobedience, the beginning point of sin, many, everyone else after him, were made sinners. But by the obedience of the one righteous man in this equation, by his willingness to fulfill the purposes of his Father, by that one shall many be made righteous. Adam made a choice. Everybody's made that choice since then. Sin's ushered in. Jesus comes and brings righteousness to the many and is able to overcome the consequences that those sinful choices brought about. Moreover, the law entered that the offense might abound, but where sin abounded, grace did much more abound. That's an interesting concept when you think about it. But Paul, I think, is just simply trying to illustrate to them that the law, and I believe he's talking about the Old Testament law. We okay with that concept? I think that's an accurate statement there. Moreover, the law entered. So we had all this time period between Adam and Moses, right? Where sin was still going on, but we had no law. We had no specific written in stone law. So then Paul you can almost hear somebody reading this letter, and in their mind up to this point, they say to themselves, well then why? Why even bring the law, right? Why did we even need this law? If we had the problem of sin without it, and we had the problem of sin with it, why did we even need it? And so Paul says the reason the law entered, that the offense might abound, but where sin abounded, grace did much more abound. The law was established, if I understand what Paul's saying correctly. So as we lead up until the time that Jesus comes, we will have a clearly defined evidence. Why do we need Jesus when He gets here? And because of the law, it will be easy to see exactly why. But it's challenging, right? Let's go back to our earlier discussion. It's a little bit hard for us to understand. How did Cain sin? Did he really know? How did he know? We have to speculate, right? Because we don't have any specific things said about them. If they weren't given a specific law like Adam was, where God said, don't eat of that fruit, and he does anyway, okay, that's a clear case, so we can understand that. But he said, sin came not just those who committed the similitude of Adam, but all kinds of other types of sins too. And so what I believe Paul's simply saying is that one purpose, I don't know that he's talking about the exclusive purpose of the Old Testament law, but one purpose that it served was that so we could clearly define and understand where the violations of God's will occurred, therefore pointing very clearly to the necessity of Jesus and the grace that He's offering. There should be... The gospel came, go back to chapter 1. The gospel came, remembering this is a letter. The gospel came, Paul said, to the who first? The Jew first and also the Greek. If anybody should have understood the consequence of sinful behavior and violation of God's will, and the need for an answer to that, who should have understood that first? The Jews should, right? Because they had that Mosaic law. They had this clearly defined law that was pointing out the violations and the errors and the problems. There's all kinds of reasons to me why the Jew first and also the Greek. The Greek's going to have a more difficult time, right? He's going to have to kind of look at his basic conduct of life and evaluate where did he breach the natural laws of God? How did he step outside of the bounds of what he should have understood was the will of God? Jew didn't have that problem. He could just look at the Old Testament law and say, right there's where I made my mistake. Right there's my violation. And so the law entered that the offense might abound. That's not permissive. That's definitive. That's to instruct them. These were the errors. These are the things that were contrary. But where sin abounded, what happens? Grace did much more about
Is it safe to say for this person that the law was brought about not for redemption, but to point out the need for the redemption?
Yeah. And I think that's it. I think, and both of those things are correct. It reveals a knowledge and clear understanding of what sin is. It defines it. And it comes about so that hopefully, after a period of failure in relationship to that law, people would recognize there's no hope here. This law simply is telling me each time I step out of bounds, there's no hope, there's no answer, there's no permanent remedy. I mean, they had the constant visual reminder of the high priest going into the holiest of holies how many times? Once a year, every year, right? Back in there, It was a continual reminder, not just of their obligations to God, but it was a continual reminder that they still hadn't solved the problem of sin. Because every year the high priest has got to go back in and do it all over again until Jesus comes. The law entered so there'd be a knowledge of sin, so that they could recognize a need beyond the law for remedy of sin. And here's kind of the clincher argument Paul's driving. Grace did much more about. Which is greater? Grace or the Old Testament law? Grace. If you want a little simple, concise little thought at the end of this long discussion and illustration that Paul offers, there's your nugget of simplicity. Grace is bigger than sin. Sin abounded because of the Old Testament law. Grace, stronger, greater. That as sin hath reigned unto death, even so might grace reign through righteousness unto eternal life by Christ, or by Jesus Christ, our Lord. Law couldn't provide what they needed. The law only put them under the condemnation of the reign of death that sin results in. Grace abounds and overcomes and overwhelms the death and challenge that sin brings about. Go ahead, Brian.
That takes me to Titus, chapter 3, verse 5. Well, verse 4. But after that, the kindness and love of our God, our Savior, toward me appeared, not by works of righteousness which we have done, but according to His mercy He saved us, by the washing of regeneration and renewing of the Holy Ghost, which He shed on us abundantly through Jesus Christ our Savior, that being justified by His unprofitable, but not profitable.
Yeah, you're fine.
Grace, we should be made heirs according to the hope of eternal law.
Yeah.
Beforehand, we were not heirs.
Yeah. And what's interesting to a Jew, the assumption is that I am the what? I am an heir. But Paul writes to Rome, he writes to Titus, and explains that's just not the case. We became heirs because of Jesus from that point forward.
Just a simple illustration, Brian, of the old law. I kind of think of the old law as a ladder that's bridging between man and God at a specific time in history. And in that law, or within that law, man is tempted always to climb rung after rung after rung. And fell down, rung after rung. Maybe made a little progress, but never reached the top of the ladder. And at the top of the ladder is Christ reaching down and picks up.
Yeah.
Just an illustration.
And the hard part, and I suppose the hard part for his audience, Jewish audience, would be to recognize that's exactly what they were. They were a ladder or a bridge to get from that time period of the patriarchs to the coming of the Savior. And when they thought that system would be a permanent circumstance. And it's hard. I imagine it would have been hard to kind of accept the fact that my inheritance isn't tied to my Jewish blood, but it's tied to the blood of the Lamb. And the challenge of that. Okay, chapter 6, Lord willing, then, next Sunday, this coming Wednesday night is training class. So next Sunday, we'll get into chapter 6.